Hey everyone. Tonight we're wandering somewhere sun-bleached and marble-columned and, frankly, a little more emotionally complicated than you were probably expecting. Ancient Greece, home of philosophy, olive oil on absolutely everything, and a culture that talked about love between men so openly, so publicly, and so philosophically that entire dinner parties were built around debating what it actually meant. We're talking wine-soaked symposiums, poetry carved into pottery, a small army made entirely of couples, and a whole society that had very firm, very specific, and very different opinions from the ones you probably grew up with. Forget the marble statues standing still in museums. Tonight, they get up and walk around. Before we wander into the agora, a warm and sincere thank you to the listener who suggested tonight's destination. Your ideas genuinely shape where this channel travels next, and this little show only grows because of thoughtful suggestions like yours. So, if you're enjoying these late-night journeys, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what happens here. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you, because somehow it's always far too late somewhere. And if you'd rather drift off with just your ears, the channel is now on Spotify as well, so the link is waiting for you down in the description. Now, dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, and get comfortable, because we're about to walk a very long way in sandals. Let's pause for a second before we go. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to sit at a dinner party where love itself was the topic of formal debate? Could you hold your own in a room where grown men discussed the nature of the soul between sips of watered wine? Would you understand a culture that built entire military units around romantic devotion and considered it a tactical advantage? Could you tell the difference between the many, many Greek words for love when your own language only bothered to invent one? And could you walk through a city that celebrated the male form in bronze and marble on every corner, while still holding views on love, marriage, and family that would surprise you at every turn? And now, congratulations. You've just stepped off a creaking wooden ship into the bright, dusty harbour of Piraeus, the port of Athens, sometime in the 5th century BC. The air smells of salt, fish, and crushed thyme. A donkey is blocking the road, and nobody seems to mind. Welcome to Greece. Try not to trip over a philosopher. The road up from the harbour is not paved so much as suggested, a dusty track worn smooth by centuries of sandaled feet, cartwheels, and the occasional stubborn goat. You walk it alongside merchants hauling amphorae of oil and wine, soldiers in bronze that catches the sun like a held breath, and a steady stream of people who all seem to be arguing about something, cheerfully, at full volume. Arguing, it turns out, is something of a national pastime here. It's less a flaw in the culture and more the whole point of it. The city itself announces itself before you can see it properly. The Acropolis rising up on its rock like a crown someone left out in the sun to bleach. Up close, the Parthenon is not the sterile white ruin you might picture from a textbook. It's painted. Loudly. Reds, blues, golds on every frieze and column, a temple that looks less like a solemn monument and more like it's dressed for a party it's been attending for 400 years straight. History has a way of scrubbing the colour out of things and calling the result dignity. Down below, the city itself is a tangle of narrow streets, whitewashed houses and open doorways where you can smell someone's dinner of lentils and grilled fish drifting out into the road. It is loud, close, and completely unbothered by your presence. Nobody in ancient Athens has ever once considered that a tourist might be watching. You are simply another body moving through a very crowded, very opinionated city. And the city has absolutely no time to notice you noticing it. What you'll come to understand quickly is that Athens runs on two currencies: reputation and conversation. Everyone knows everyone's business, and everyone has an opinion about it, which they will share with you unprompted, at length, whether or not you asked. It's a small town wearing the costume of a great city, and like all small towns, its real business is gossip conducted with unusual seriousness and a great deal of wine. By the time you've walked 10 minutes into the city proper, you've already been jostled by 2 donkey carts, nearly stepped on a chicken that seems to have escaped from somewhere important, and been offered a suspiciously specific price on a jug of oil by a man who has clearly been waiting his whole life for a foreigner exactly like you. The streets themselves twist without warning, narrow enough in places that you could touch both walls at once, opening suddenly into small squares where women gather at a public fountain, filling clay jars and trading news with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggests this happens every single morning, rain or shine, empire or no empire. The smell changes block by block. Here it's wood smoke and roasting chestnuts. Turn a corner and it's the sharp, briny punch of the fish stalls, then leather being tanned somewhere you can't quite see, then, blessedly, the warm, yeasty smell of a bakery pulling flatbread from a clay oven. Athens does not smell like a museum. It smells like a city that is very much alive and mildly overwhelmed by its own success. You'll notice, too, that everyone seems to know exactly where they're going, except you. Men in short tunics move briskly toward the agora or the law courts, arguing points of civic business at a volume better suited to a stadium. Slaves move through the crowd with baskets and messages, invisible in the way that made this entire economy function, though we'll come back to that honestly later. Children dart between legs, chasing a hoop with a stick, doing what children have done in every century since someone first invented a hoop and a stick. What nobody tells you, and what you learn quickly enough on your own, is that Athens in this era is not actually a large city by any modern measure. Its entire free citizen population could comfortably fit inside a single modern sports stadium, which is precisely why gossip travels here at the speed of sound, and why your own arrival, however unremarkable you feel, has probably already been noted, discussed, and mildly exaggerated by at least 3 separate households before lunch. Ever walked into a small town where everyone somehow already knows your business before you've unpacked your bags? Athens invented that feeling and then built an entire civilization's worth of philosophy, politics, and gossip on top of it. You'll want to get used to it quickly, because it's about to become the operating system for absolutely everything else you experience here tonight. Let's talk about the agora, the great open marketplace at the heart of the city, because it is nothing like a modern market and everything like a modern coffee shop that also happens to sell fish. Stalls selling olives, pottery, sandals, and slightly suspicious cheese sit shoulder to shoulder with men doing what appears to be absolutely nothing except standing around talking, which, as it turns out, was considered a perfectly respectable full-time occupation. This is where philosophy actually happened, not in quiet libraries, but in the middle of a crowded marketplace, shouted over the din of a fishmonger loudly disputing the freshness of his own product. A man named Socrates famously spent his days here, cornering strangers with questions that seemed simple and were, in fact, elaborate traps designed to make you realize you didn't know anything at all. Imagine being stopped on your way to buy bread by a barefoot man who wants to discuss the true nature of justice, and you cannot politely leave because leaving would be an admission that you have no answer. It's the ancient equivalent of getting cornered by someone selling you on a pyramid scheme, except the product is self-knowledge, and you cannot simply block his number. The agora also functioned as the city's unofficial court of public opinion. Reputations were made and unmade here in an afternoon. A man's standing depended enormously on how he was seen to behave, who he was seen with, and how gracefully he handled himself in public, which becomes rather important later tonight when we get to the subject of love. Citizenship itself was sorted out here too, in a rough and tumble sort of way. Only free adult men born of Athenian parents counted as full citizens with a public voice, a detail that shaped nearly everything else about how the culture organized affection, marriage, and status. Women, foreigners, and enslaved people lived within the same walls, but occupied a completely different social universe, one we'll return to honestly later, because a fair account of this world has to hold its shadows as well as its sunlight. For now, though, you wander the stalls, haggle badly over a jar of honey, and get cornered by exactly one barefoot philosopher, because in ancient Athens, that's simply Tuesday. The stalls themselves are a study in barely organized chaos. A potter shouts prices for cups still warm from the kiln. A woman sells cheese wrapped in fig leaves, swatting away flies with the weary precision of someone who has done this every single day of her adult life. Somewhere behind you, a man is loudly and passionately arguing that his sandals are, in fact, worth twice what the buyer is offering, an argument that will apparently continue until one party simply gives up out of exhaustion, which seems to be the unofficial way most transactions here get resolved. The noise itself has a texture to it, the clatter of pottery being stacked, the bleating of a goat somebody is trying to sell, sandaled feet slapping against packed earth, and threaded through all of it, that low, constant hum of argument, everyone's voice pitched just slightly louder than necessary, as though volume itself were a form of conviction. You'll notice quickly that nobody here seems to whisper. Whispering suggests you're unsure of your opinion, and unsure is not a look anyone in this marketplace is going for. Beyond the produce and the pottery, entire sections of the agora are given over to public buildings, The stoa, long-covered colonnades where merchants display goods out of the sun, and philosophers happen to conduct their business at the exact same time, so that buying a jar of honey and being cornered into an unplanned debate about the nature of virtue can technically happen in the same 10-minute errand. It's less a marketplace with philosophy occasionally breaking out, and more a permanent open-air seminar that also, conveniently, sells cheese. The agora also served as the city's administrative heart, home to the law courts, the mint striking Athens' own silver coins stamped with its beloved owl, and public notice boards where decrees, court summonses, and civic announcements were posted for any citizen literate enough to read them, which, conveniently, doubled as the fastest way for a piece of gossip to become official public record by lunchtime. By midday, the crowd thins slightly as the heat climbs, vendors retreating into whatever shade the stoa offers, though the arguing never fully stops. It just relocates indoors, still audible from the street, muffled only slightly by stone columns that have clearly heard worse. Ever tried to have a quiet conversation in a room where 3 other unrelated arguments are also happening at full volume? Welcome to Athenian public life, where privacy is a myth, and everyone's opinion is, apparently, everyone else's business too. Let's pause here on something genuinely useful, because it's going to save you a great deal of confusion later. The Greeks did not have one word for love, the way modern English does. They had several, and each one meant something distinct enough that mixing them up would have gotten you some very confused looks at a dinner party. There was philia, the deep affection between friends, comrades, and family, the bond soldiers felt for the man beside them in the battle line. There was storge, the quiet, unglamorous love of parents for children. There was agape, a more selfless, universal goodwill. And then there was eros, passionate, romantic, and physical desire, the kind poets wrote about and philosophers argued over late into the night. This distinction matters enormously for tonight's journey, because when Greek culture discussed love between men, it was frequently discussing several of these categories at once, tangled together in ways that don't map cleanly onto modern categories at all. A bond between 2 adult male friends who fought side by side in the phalanx might be described with the language of philia and pride. A romantic and physical relationship between 2 adult men might be framed through eros, discussed as openly and seriously as any love between a man and a woman. It's the difference between calling something a business partnership and calling it a marriage. Both are real, both are valued. They are simply not the same thing, and the Greeks had the vocabulary to keep them straight, while we, several thousand years later, mostly just have the one overworked word doing all the heavy lifting. Think of it like a group chat that somehow has a dedicated notification sound for every single kind of relationship in your life, so you always know instantly whether it's your mother, your best friend, or the person you're dating. Efficient, slightly exhausting to maintain. Entirely Greek. Consider for a moment just how much confusion this precision actually prevents. Tell a Greek citizen you love your best friend, and he knows immediately, from the word alone, that you are not proposing marriage. Tell him you love your city, and he understands you mean a civic, almost patriotic devotion, not a plan to move in together. The vocabulary itself does the emotional sorting for you before the conversation has even really begun, which is either wonderfully efficient or faintly terrifying, depending on how much you enjoy the ambiguity of your own feelings. This precision mattered enormously in a culture that discussed love, in all its forms, as openly and rigorously as it discussed politics or warfare. A speech given at a symposium in praise of philia, the devoted love between comrades, was understood to be making a claim about loyalty, sacrifice, and shared honour. A speech in praise of eros was making an entirely different claim about longing, beauty, and desire, and audiences knew instantly which conversation they were actually having. Imagine sitting through a toast at a wedding and immediately knowing, from a single word choice, whether the speaker is about to make you laugh, cry, or quietly reconsider your own relationship. That's the kind of emotional shorthand this vocabulary provided, constantly, to everyone who spoke the language. It's worth noting, too, that these categories were never as neatly separated in real life as they were on paper. A soldier's philia for the man beside him in the phalanx could shade into something that also carried the charge of eros, and Greek writers were perfectly comfortable letting those categories blur when describing the most intense relationships in their literature. Achilles and Patroclus chief among them, a thread we'll return to properly later tonight. The words gave the culture a shared vocabulary for love. They did not, and were never meant to, flatten how genuinely complicated love actually is. There's a reason this vocabulary still gets borrowed today, in wedding vows, in therapy offices, in half-remembered college philosophy courses. The Greeks were the first to write it all down this precisely, sorting the sprawling mess of human affection into categories clean enough to argue about at a dinner party. Ever tried explaining to someone why you love your dog differently than you love your best friend, differently again than you love a partner, and found yourself reaching for the exact same word 3 times in one sentence? The Greeks solved that problem a very long time ago. We just never quite caught up to the paperwork. Now, let's address the question sitting at the centre of tonight's journey, gently and honestly, because it deserves both. Romantic and physical love between men was not hidden in ancient Greece. It was not whispered about, tucked away, or treated as scandalous in the way it would be in many later centuries. It appears openly in poetry, in vase paintings, in philosophy, in comedy, and in the biographies of some of the culture's most respected figures. Historians studying Greek society consistently point out that attraction and romantic devotion between men was, in many city-states, simply understood as a normal part of the emotional landscape, not something requiring justification or apology. That said, it's worth being careful here, because the modern idea of sexual orientation, gay or straight as fixed categories of identity, doesn't quite translate onto the ancient Greek framework. The distinction that mattered most to them wasn't who you were attracted to, but the role you played in a relationship. Questions of status, age, and social position. A relationship between 2 adult male citizens of roughly equal standing was viewed differently than other configurations, and different city-states held genuinely different attitudes. Athens, Sparta, and Thebes each had their own customs, their own boundaries, their own sense of what was admirable and what crossed a line. What stayed consistent across much of Greek culture was this: the capacity to love another man, deeply and passionately, was not seen as being in conflict with also marrying a woman, raising a family, and fulfilling every expected duty of a citizen. Marriage, as we'll get to shortly, was largely a practical civic institution built around family and property. Romantic passion, meanwhile, often lived somewhere else entirely, in friendships, in mentorships, in bombs forged on the battlefield. The two tracks ran side by side, rather than in competition with one another, which is a genuinely different emotional architecture than the one most of us grew up inside. This is a topic historians continue to study and debate carefully, and the honest answer is that Greek attitudes were neither a simple utopia of acceptance nor a simple story of tolerance we'd recognize today. They were something stranger and more specific to their own time, worth understanding on its own terms, rather than flattened into a modern headline. Let's look at where this actually shows up in the historical record, because it isn't simply implied by later interpretation. It was argued over, in public, in an actual courtroom, with real political stakes attached. One of the most revealing surviving documents from ancient Athens is a court speech called Against Timarchus, delivered by the politician Aeschines in the 340s BC, in which he attempts to strip a political rival of his citizen rights by attacking his past conduct. The case rested on a genuinely revealing legal distinction. Athenian law did not punish a citizen for loving another man. It did, however, strip certain rights from a citizen who had prostituted himself, on the theory that a man who had sold his body for money had shown himself unfit to speak in the assembly on behalf of the city's honor. Respectable romantic pursuit, conducted with restraint, gifts, and dignity, was one thing. Paid transaction was legally and socially another thing entirely. And an ambitious politician's entire career could be quietly ended by a well-timed accusation blurring the two. Picture the scene itself, because it's wonderfully theatrical. Jurors, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, crowded onto wooden benches, a water clock trickling away to time each speaker's allotted argument, and Aeschines pacing back and forth, cataloguing his rival's youthful reputation in exhaustive, faintly gleeful detail, while the accused sat there, absorbing every word in front of half the city. It is essentially the ancient Athenian version of a political smear campaign, digging through someone's old messages and reading them aloud to a packed room. Except the room also gets to vote afterward on whether you're allowed to keep your job. What this tells us, beyond the specific scandal itself, is that Greek attitudes toward love between men were never simply a blanket cultural approval with no rules attached. There were rules, and they were taken seriously enough to end a political career over. Reputation, restraint, and the manner in which a relationship was conducted mattered enormously, sorting what was admired from what was actionable in a court of law. It's love as both a private feeling and a matter of genuine public record, judged not on who you loved, but on how visibly, how respectably, and how expensively you'd conducted yourself while doing it. Ever had an old decision follow you into a job interview decades later? The Athenians invented that particular horror too. They just made you defend it in front of 500 of your closest neighbours, with a water clock counting down the seconds until it was someone else's turn to ruin your evening. Let's take a short detour north and west, because it would be a mistake to talk about Greek attitudes toward love between men as though Athens spoke for the whole country. It didn't. Sparta, Athens' great rival, ran on a completely different set of assumptions, and comparing the two tells you a great deal about how varied this culture actually was from city to city. From the age of 7, Spartan boys were removed from their families entirely and raised by the state in a brutal training system called the agora, designed to produce nothing but soldiers. Within that system, older youths were formally paired with younger ones as mentors, a relationship that carried real romantic and social weight, and that the Spartans openly credited with making their army more cohesive and more fearsome in battle. A young soldier fought harder, the thinking went, with someone he loved watching his back and his reputation both at once. It's less a battle plan and more a very intense buddy system, if the buddy system also involved spears. What makes Sparta a genuinely useful contrast, though, is what happened everywhere else in Spartan life. Spartan women, unlike their counterparts in Athens, received formal physical education, competed in athletics, owned property, and moved through public life with a degree of independence that visiting Athenians found faintly scandalous. Sparta wasn't more restrictive than Athens across the board. It was differently organized, prizing military cohesion and physical excellence in both sexes over the domestic philosophical model Athens preferred. Ever met two neighboring towns with wildly different unspoken rules about the exact same subject? Ancient Greece had that problem at a national scale, and everyone had strong opinions about whose version was correct. Sensory detail helps here, because Spartan daily life was, by design, nothing like Athens' leisurely marketplace debates. Spartan boys once swept into the agoge at 7, slept on reed mats they were expected to gather themselves from the riverbank, wore a single thin cloak through brutal winters, and were deliberately underfed, on the theory that a certain amount of hunger built resourcefulness. They were famously served a notorious black broth, a blood and vinegar concoction so unpleasant that visiting foreigners reportedly could not choke it down, prompting one to remark that he finally understood why Spartans weren't afraid to die. Within this harsh communal upbringing, the mentor bond between an older youth and a younger one wasn't a side detail. It was structurally load-bearing. The older partner was expected to model discipline, courage, and restraint, and was held publicly responsible, in a very real sense, for his younger companion's conduct and reputation. A disgraced younger partner reflected badly on his mentor, and a mentor who behaved dishonorably brought shame on both of them at once. A mutual accountability system enforced through communal dining halls called syssitia, where every citizen soldier ate together nightly, reporting for duty to the same stew pot for his entire adult life, rich or poor, king or commoner. It's worth pausing on how different this feels from the Athenian model we've spent most of tonight inside. Athens turned love into a topic for wine and philosophy, argued over on couches until the small hours. Sparta turned it into a load-bearing structural beam of military discipline, tested not through poetry, but through cold mornings, empty stomachs, and formation drills. Imagine the difference between a university's philosophy department and its varsity football program, both claiming the exact same subject as their specialty. And you're most of the way to understanding Sparta's relationship with Athens. And then there's the question of Spartan women, worth sitting with a moment longer, because it complicates any simple story about which city was more restrictive. A Spartan girl trained in running, wrestling, and javelin throwing, the belief being that strong mothers produced strong soldiers, and she could inherit and control property directly, a right many Athenian women never held in their entire lives. Sparta wasn't a gentler society by any means. Its whole civic machine ran on hardship, but it distributed its severity and its freedoms across both sexes in a pattern that would have struck a visiting Athenian as thoroughly upside down. Ever met a family where the strict parent turns out to be surprisingly progressive about exactly one specific thing? Sparta was that family, scaled up to an entire city-state, and everyone else in Greece simply had to work around it. Let's talk about the symposium, because it is where an enormous amount of this cultural life actually played out, over wine, reclining furniture, and a truly impressive amount of talking. A symposium was a formal drinking party held in the andron, the men's dining room of a wealthy household, and it was a strictly male affair, save for the hired entertainers. Guests reclined on couches arranged around the walls, propped on one elbow in a pose that looks, to modern eyes, somewhere between deeply relaxed and mildly unwell. Wine was mixed with water in a large communal bowl called a krater, because drinking it undiluted was considered something only barbarians or the truly desperate would attempt. A symposiarch, elected for the evening, decided how strong to mix the wine and how the night would unfold, which is essentially the ancient version of someone being voted DJ and bartender at the same party. The evening moved through toasts, riddles, games, music from a hired flute girl, and often serious philosophical conversation, the kind immortalized in Plato's dialogues. It was here that eros, in all its forms, was discussed as a legitimate subject of intellectual inquiry, not as gossip, but as philosophy. Grown men reclining on couches, well into their cups, debating the true nature of love with the same seriousness they'd bring to debating justice or the good life. Imagine your book club, if your book club met weekly, ran on wine instead of coffee, and considered romantic feelings a topic worthy of the same rigorous analysis as tax policy. The symposium was also, quite openly, a space where romantic and social bonds between men were formed, celebrated, and discussed. Poetry recited over the wine bowl might address desire, longing, and beauty in the same breath as it discussed the last military campaign. It was social life, entertainment, and philosophy seminar rolled into one long, increasingly unsteady evening. Once the meal itself was cleared away, the real business of the evening began, and it did not begin quietly. A libation was poured first, wine tipped onto the floor in honor of the gods, because even a night of drinking required proper acknowledgement of who was technically still in charge. Garlands of ivy or myrtle were passed around and settled onto every head in the room, partly decorative, partly medicinal, since ivy was believed, incorrectly but with total confidence, to ward off drunkenness. It did not work. Nobody in the room seemed particularly bothered by this. Entertainment ranged from the intellectual to the deeply silly. A favourite party game called Cotterboss involved flinging the dregs of your wine cup at a small target across the room, aiming for a bronze disc balanced on a stand, with points awarded for accuracy and considerable social embarrassment awarded for missing entirely and soaking the guest beside you instead. It is essentially ancient Greece's answer to beer pong. Minus the beer, minus the pong, but with every bit of the same competitive, slightly reckless enthusiasm. The hired flute girl, or occasionally a small ensemble of musicians and dancers, provided the evening's soundtrack, a thin, reedy melody threading beneath the conversation, rising when the room grew rowdy, softening when a guest launched into a serious speech. These performers were typically enslaved or otherwise dependent workers, a detail worth remembering honestly, since the leisurely intellectual atmosphere the symposium is remembered for rested, like so much else in this world, on labour that had no voice in the room's philosophical debates. As the wine bowl emptied and refilled and emptied again, the conversation deepened. Riddles gave way to genuine argument. Argument gave way to poetry recited from memory. Verses about longing, beauty, and desire performed with a kind of dramatic flourish usually reserved for a modern open mic night. Except everyone in the audience had strong, immediate opinions, and no hesitation whatsoever about sharing them mid-recitation. By the small hours, some guests had drifted into quiet, serious philosophy. Others had simply drifted face down onto their own couch, garland askew, having peaked several toasts earlier than planned. Ever hosted a dinner party that started with genuine intellectual ambition and ended with someone asleep on the good cushions? The symposium invented that particular arc of the evening and refined it gloriously into an actual social institution. Let's stay in that same warm, wine-lit room a little longer, because one particular evening, or at least one particular philosophical dialogue describing an evening, became one of the most influential texts on love ever written. Plato's Symposium imagines a dinner party where each guest takes a turn giving a speech in praise of love. It's a wonderfully strange structure for a philosophical text, essentially a series of TED Talks delivered by increasingly drunk men on a single, sprawling topic. One speaker, the comic playwright Aristophanes, offers a story you may already know without realizing where it came from: that humans were originally round, four-armed, four-legged creatures, split in two by the gods as punishment for their arrogance, and that love ever since has been each half's desperate search for its missing other. It's the ancient Greek origin of the phrase, "my other half," and it's worth remembering that every time you use it, you're quoting a 2,000-year-old comedy routine about cosmic breakups. Socrates, in his turn, redirects the whole conversation somewhere more abstract, describing love as a kind of ladder, beginning with attraction to a single beautiful person, and climbing upward through stages toward an appreciation of beauty itself, and eventually toward wisdom and the eternal forms. It's romantic love, reframed as a philosophical training program, which is either the most or least romantic thing you've ever heard, depending entirely on your mood and how much wine you've had. What's worth sitting with here is how seriously this culture took the intellectual work of love. These weren't dismissed as private, silly, or beneath serious thought. They were considered worthy of the same rigorous, structured argument as questions of politics or ethics, discussed by name in public texts, meant to be read and debated for generations. And it worked. We are, several thousand years later, still discussing that speech about split-apart soulmates at dinner parties of our own. Before Socrates ever gets his turn, several other guests offer their own theories, and it's worth lingering on them because the dialogue works less like a single lecture and more like a room full of people who all showed up convinced they'd cracked the topic completely. Phaedrus opens by praising love as a force capable of inspiring genuine courage, arguing that an army made entirely of devoted lovers would fight more fiercely than any other force alive, a claim that, as we'll see shortly tonight, wasn't just philosophical theory. Someone actually built that army. Pausanias follows with a more careful distinction, dividing love itself into two categories: a lower, common variety concerned mainly with physical pleasure, and a higher, more heavenly variety concerned with virtue, wisdom, and the soul. A framework meant to sort respectable devotion from mere appetite, echoing the same anxious line-drawing we saw earlier in that Athenian courtroom. Then, Agathon, the host, delivers a speech of such polished, flowery beauty about love's grace and gentleness that the room reportedly bursts into applause, prompting Socrates to gently point out, in his usual infuriating style, that a beautiful speech isn't necessarily a true one. Only then does Socrates offer his own account, and rather than claiming the wisdom himself, he attributes it to a wise woman named Diotima, who supposedly once taught him this very framework. Love, in her telling, begins as attraction to a single, beautiful body, then widens to an appreciation of physical beauty in general, then climbs further still toward beauty of mind and character, then toward the beauty found in laws and institutions, and finally, at the very top of this long climb, toward beauty itself, eternal and unchanging, the philosophical form behind every lesser beautiful thing you've ever admired. It's a genuinely strange arc for a love story to take, starting at a dinner party crush and ending somewhere in abstract metaphysics. Rather like beginning a conversation about your weekend plans and somehow ending it discussing the nature of existence itself. What's remarkable is how enduring this ladder became. Later thinkers, centuries removed from that original wine-soaked room, would build entire philosophical and even religious traditions on the idea that romantic longing could be the very first rung of a much longer climb towards something higher. Ever fallen for someone and found yourself suddenly reading poetry, taking up painting, or generally becoming a marginally better person than you were the week before? Congratulations, you've climbed the first two rungs of Socrates' ladder without realizing it, several thousand years after he first described the staircase. Let's head to the gymnasium next, a word that in ancient Greek quite literally means place of nakedness, which tells you almost everything you need to know before we even walk inside. The gymnasium was where citizen men trained, wrestled, ran, and socialized, entirely nude, oiled with olive oil, dusted with fine sand to improve their grip. It sounds, to modern ears, like an extremely specific and slightly alarming fitness class. But to the Greeks, it was simply how you exercised, and nudity here carried none of the charge it might elsewhere. The human male form, athletic, toned, and on constant public display, was considered a genuine object of civic pride and artistic celebration, which is exactly why so much surviving Greek sculpture looks like an advertisement for a gym membership nobody needed to be talked into. The gymnasium was also, importantly, a social and educational space, where older men mentored younger ones, not only in athletics, but in the values and conduct expected of a citizen. It was here that many of the bonds we've been discussing tonight actually formed, in a setting that mixed physical culture, education, and social life into something without a clean modern equivalent. Imagine your gym, your alumni network, and your philosophy seminar all located in the same building, and you're most of the way there. Painted pottery from the period shows scenes from the gymnasium constantly, athletes captured mid-throw, mid-stride, mid-conversation, a visual record of a culture that considered the trained male body worth looking at, discussing, and depicting, again and again, on nearly every surface available. Step inside properly, and the gymnasium reveals itself as considerably more organized than the word place of nakedness might suggest. A large open courtyard for running and throwing sat beside a covered colonnade for shade, and attached to most gymnasiums was a smaller building called the palestra, dedicated specifically to wrestling, its floor churned soft with fine sand to cushion every throw and grip. The air here carried a very specific mixed scent, olive oil warmed by skin and sun, the dry mineral dust of the wrestling pit, and underneath it all, the faint tang of sweat that no amount of oil could quite mask. A smell every regular visitor apparently found perfectly normal, and every first-time foreign visitor found utterly overwhelming. Training here wasn't casual. Young citizen men, called ephebes once they reached the edge of adulthood, trained rigorously in running, wrestling, javelin and discus, preparing bodies that were meant to serve the city as soldiers as much as athletes, since, in a world without professional armies, every citizen was expected to be battle-ready. Trainers moved between wrestling pairs, correcting stance and grip with the same blunt authority a modern coach might use. Except here, the whole enterprise was also, quite openly, considered an artistic subject worth commissioning a sculptor over. And commission sculptors they did. The idealized male form you've seen in a museum, weight shifted naturally onto one leg, muscles carved with anatomical precision, expression serene rather than strained, began its life as an actual observation made in exactly this courtyard, watching real athletes move, throw, and rest between bouts. The gymnasium functioned as a kind of permanent life-drawing studio that also happened to double as a gym, a social club, and an informal finishing school for citizenship, all under one roof, all conducted without a stitch of clothing anywhere in sight. It's worth remembering, too, that the gymnasium's social function ran every bit as deep as its athletic one. Conversations begun mid-wrestling match continued over cooling down walks through the shaded colonnade, older men offering guidance not just on grip and footwork, but on how a citizen ought to carry himself, speak in public, and conduct his affairs, romantic and otherwise. Ever wondered what it would feel like if your gym, your mentor, and your entire social calendar were somehow the exact same building? The Greeks never had to wonder. They just called it Tuesday. Let's step outside the gymnasium and into something considerably larger, because the same culture of athletic display, held every 4 years at the sacred site of Olympia, became the single greatest gathering of the entire Greek world. For the duration of the Games, a formal truce was declared across every rival city-state. Warring armies laid down their weapons, and safe passage was guaranteed to any citizen travelling to compete or watch. It's a genuinely remarkable idea when you sit with it. An entire fractious, constantly bickering civilization agreeing, by shared custom, to pause its wars for the sake of a foot race. Imagine convincing every feuding neighbour on your street to call a temporary ceasefire because the county fair is happening, and somehow it actually works, for centuries. Athletes competed entirely nude, oiled and dusted just as they trained back home, in events like sprinting, wrestling, boxing, javelin and discus, watched by tens of thousands of spectators crammed into the surrounding hillsides with essentially no shade, no seating, and no patience for a slow race. The prize for winning was, on paper, absurdly modest, a simple wreath of wild olive leaves. In practice, an Olympic victor returned home a celebrity for life, honoured with statues, poems commissioned in his name, free meals for the rest of his days, and a reputation that outlasted most kings. It was fame with essentially no cash value attached, which somehow made the whole enterprise even more fiercely competitive, not less. The Games were also, in their own way, a showcase for exactly the values we've been discussing tonight. The trained male body celebrated openly, mentorship between older and younger athletes considered part of proper preparation, and the whole event soaked in the same civic pride that shaped the gymnasium back home. Every 4 years, the entire Greek world simply agreed to stop fighting each other and watch strong men run instead, which, all things considered, may be one of the more sensible ideas this civilization ever had. Getting there in the first place was its own small odyssey. Spectators and competitors alike travelled from every corner of the Greek world, on foot, by cart, by ship, converging on the sacred valley of Olympia weeks in advance, where a temporary tent city sprang up in the surrounding fields, crowded, dusty, and reportedly unbearably hot, since the Games were held in the height of summer with essentially no organised shelter for the general public. Ancient writers complained cheerfully about the flies, the heat, and the price gouging on food and water, proof that some traditions, unfortunately, are truly timeless. Before any of this could begin, official heralds called spondophoroi travelled ahead of the crowds to every city-state, formally announcing the sacred truce and warning that any army caught marching through Elis, the region hosting the Games, would face the collective wrath of the entire Greek world. It largely worked remarkably for the better part of a millennium, a fragile peace held together not by treaty, but by shared religious conviction and the simple, universal desire to watch someone else's countrymen lose a foot race. One detail tends to surprise modern audiences the most. Married women were formally barred from attending or even watching the Games, on pain of death according to tradition, a restriction historians still debate the practical enforcement of, though the story survives that one mother disguised herself as a trainer to watch her son compete, and was pardoned only because her own family's Olympic victories were too illustrious to punish. Unmarried women, by contrast, faced no such restriction, and the priestess of the goddess Demeter was granted a place of honor to watch. A strange and specific carve-out that tells you a great deal about how tangled religion, gender, and spectacle were here. Ever tried explaining a modern venue's confusing blackout rules to someone from out of town? The ancient Olympics had you beat by several thousand years, and considerably higher stakes for getting it wrong. Let's talk about pottery for a moment, because an enormous amount of what historians actually know about daily life, courtship, and social custom in ancient Greece comes not from philosophy texts at all, but from painted vases, cups, and wine jars, meant originally for nothing more glamorous than holding dinner. Greek pottery painters worked in two dominant styles across the centuries: black figures painted onto reddish clay, and later red figures left in the natural clay colour against a painted black background. And onto these surfaces they recorded an astonishing visual catalogue of everyday life. Scenes from the gymnasium, the symposium, the marketplace, and courtship customs all appear again and again, following recognisable artistic conventions that repeat from workshop to workshop, almost like a shared visual vocabulary everyone understood on sight. Courtship itself had its own established visual grammar. A suitor is shown offering a customary gift, often a hare, a rooster, or a wreath, gestures art historians have cross-referenced with the literary sources to piece together the actual etiquette of the era: who could court whom, what gifts signalled serious intent, and what a graceful decline looked like versus an insulting one. These vases functioned in a sense as the era's advertising and its etiquette manual rolled into one, since many were made specifically to be used, admired, and passed around at the very symposiums where courtship customs were being enacted in the room. It's worth appreciating just how much these fragile, everyday objects have told us. Long after the philosophers stopped arguing and the empires that followed rearranged the map entirely, it was the drinking cups, dug carefully out of the ground centuries later, that ended up confirming, correcting, and occasionally contradicting the more polished official version handed down in the texts. Never underestimate what a society's dinnerware is quietly recording about it. One particular detail found on countless surviving vases deserves special mention: a short painted inscription historians call a kalos label, simply naming a young man as beautiful, sometimes attached to a specific figure in the scene, sometimes floating independently across the vase with no obvious connection to anyone painted at all, as though the potter simply wanted to publicly register his admiration for someone the whole city already knew by reputation. These inscriptions turn up by the hundreds across surviving pottery, the same names recurring across different workshops and different years, giving historians something close to a running popularity contest conducted entirely in fired clay for the most admired young men of a given Athenian generation. It's a strange thing to hold in your hands today, quite literally, since so many of these vases survive intact in museum collections, exported originally as luxury goods to wealthy buyers as far away as Etruria in modern Italy, where they were later placed in tombs and preserved, ironically, by being buried for 2,500 years. The very objects made for a rowdy Athenian drinking party ended up as some of our clearest windows into that party's actual customs, because nobody at the time thought to hide anything. Why would they? To the painter, the buyer, and the guest raising the cup to his lips, this was simply how beauty, courtship, and admiration were normally discussed and displayed, no different in spirit from carving a name into a park bench, except considerably more durable and infinitely more likely to end up under glass in a major museum. Modern audiences sometimes reach for the comparison of fan culture, a beautiful youth's name circulating across dozens of independently made vases, the way a celebrity's name might circulate across fan art today, admired publicly, repeatedly, by people who may never have exchanged a single word with the person being praised. It's not a perfect comparison, but it captures something real, a culture entirely comfortable putting admiration into permanent, decorative, widely distributed form, then eating dinner off it for years afterward. Ever written someone's name somewhere you probably shouldn't have, back when you were young enough for it to feel enormously significant? The ancient Greeks did exactly that, professionally, and then sold the results at a considerable markup. Now, a careful and important note, because an honest account of this world has to include the parts that don't sit as comfortably with modern sensibilities. Alongside relationships between adult men of equal standing, Greek society, and particularly Athenian society, also had a distinct and well-documented social custom historians call pederasty, an institution involving an older, established citizen and an adolescent youth, typically in his teenage years, structured around mentorship, education, and social advancement. With romantic and physical elements, historians continue to study and debate. It came wrapped in its own formal customs, courtship gifts like a hare or a rooster, expectations of eventual restraint, and social rules about who could properly court whom. It's worth being plain about this rather than glossing over it with a joke, because a custom involving significant age and power differences between an adult and an adolescent doesn't map onto anything most of us would recognize as healthy by today's standards. And modern historians studying the period are careful to note that it functioned within a very particular set of social, educational, and civic assumptions specific to that era, not a simple ancient version of adult relationships as we understand them now. Different city-states drew their own lines, some far more restrictive than others, and the surviving sources argue with each other constantly about where exactly propriety ended and scandal began, which tells you the ancient Greeks themselves didn't view this as uncomplicated either. We're mentioning this because leaving it out would give you an incomplete and inaccurate picture of the culture, not because it deserves lingering on, and we won't dwell on it further tonight. What we can say clearly is that the deeper, more enduring thread running through Greek culture, the one that shows up in philosophy, poetry, and history for centuries afterward, is the celebration of devoted love and partnership between adult men standing as equals, which is where we're headed next, into a battlefield of all places. It's worth noting that this same society built its own legal safeguards around these very concerns, whether or not modern readers would judge them sufficient by today's standards. The Athenian lawgiver Solon, credited with several of the city's foundational legal reforms, is recorded as having restricted adult men's access to schools and gymnasia during the specific hours reserved for younger boys, and required that any boy travelling to and from lessons be accompanied by a pedagogue, typically an enslaved household member, whose entire job was escorting and supervising him throughout the day. Historians studying these statutes point to them as evidence that Athenian society itself recognized real risk in the custom and moved, however imperfectly, to formally regulate it in law rather than leave it entirely to private discretion or good manners. None of this resolves the discomfort a modern reader rightly feels sitting with this material, and it isn't meant to. What it does show is a culture aware enough of its own customs to legislate around them, drawing boundaries in statute as well as in etiquette, even if those boundaries sat in a very different place than they would today, and even if enforcement in practice was almost certainly inconsistent. We've said what needs saying on the matter, and we'll leave it there for the evening. What deserves far more of our time tonight, and what the surviving record actually celebrates at length, in poetry, in history, and on the battlefield itself, is devoted love between adult men standing as equals, a thread that runs far deeper through this culture than any single controversial custom, and one this civilization was considerably prouder of. So let's leave the classroom and the courtroom behind entirely, and walk instead toward a battlefield, because that's where this story gets genuinely remarkable. Let's talk about the single most striking piece of evidence for how seriously this culture took love between men as a source of genuine strength: an elite military unit called the Sacred Band of Thebes. Formed in the 4th century BC, the Sacred Band was composed of 150 pairs of adult male lovers, fighting shoulder to shoulder, deliberately organized on the theory that a man would fight more fiercely and would never abandon his post in shame, standing beside the person he loved most in the world. It's a battle plan built entirely on romantic devotion, which is either the most touching or the most terrifying military strategy in ancient history, depending on how your last relationship ended. The unit became legendary, considered among the finest fighting forces in the Greek world, undefeated for decades, until it met its end at the Battle of Chaeronea against the forces of Philip II of Macedon. According to the accounts that survive, the Sacred Band fought and fell together almost to the last man, refusing to break formation or abandon their partners even in defeat. When the battlefield was later surveyed, the fallen were reportedly found in their pairs, and even their enemies are said to have been moved by the sight of it. The Sacred Band stands as one of history's clearest examples of a society building an institution, publicly, formally, and with total seriousness, around the premise that romantic love between men was not a private matter to be tolerated quietly, but a civic virtue capable of shaping the outcome of nations. It's the ancient equivalent of a government deciding that love, specifically, is a tactical resource worth investing in, which is a genuinely wild sentence to say out loud, and also, apparently, exactly what happened. The unit's origins are worth knowing, because they weren't accidental. A Theban commander named Gorgodas is credited with first assembling the Sacred Band around 378 BC, drawing directly on the philosophical argument we heard echoed at Plato's symposium earlier tonight. The idea that an army, bound by mutual devotion, would hold its line more fiercely than one bound by pay or obligation alone. Gorgodas initially distributed the paired lovers throughout the wider Theban army to stiffen every unit's resolve, before his successor, the brilliant general Pelopidas, gathered them instead into a single elite formation, trained and quartered together, answerable only to their own commanders, treated essentially as the city's special forces. Picture the unit itself for a moment. 150 pairs standing shoulder to shoulder in the front ranks of the phalanx, each man positioned deliberately beside the person whose good opinion and whose safety mattered to him more than anything else alive. Ancient writers describing the unit noted that a soldier might tolerate being seen fleeing by a stranger, but would rather die than be seen retreating by the man he loved, an argument that reads today less like military theory and more like the world's most effective, if extreme, incentive structure. Under Pelopidas, and later the legendary general Epaminondas, the sacred band helped shatter Sparta's supposed military invincibility at the Battle of Leuctra, a genuinely stunning upset that reshaped the balance of power across the entire Greek world for a generation. Its final stand at Chaeronea in 338 BC against the young and rapidly rising power of Macedon marked the effective end of independent Greek city-state resistance to Philip and his son, a boy not yet 20 at the time, named Alexander, who commanded the cavalry that broke the Theban line that day, a detail that connects two of tonight's most striking stories rather more closely than you might expect. Centuries later, a stone lion monument was raised over the mass grave believed to hold the sacred band's fallen, and when the site was excavated in the modern era, archaeologists found skeletal remains arranged in orderly rows beneath it, precisely where ancient accounts said the pairs had fallen together. Ever wondered what it takes for a piece of oral history to still check out archaeologically 2,500 years later? Apparently, devotion this well documented tends to leave remarkably good receipts. Let's talk about the two names that come up more than any others whenever this subject is raised: Achilles and Patroclus, the warrior heroes at the center of Homer's Iliad, and the subject of an argument that has technically been running for roughly 3,000 years without ever fully resolving. Homer's original text describes the bond between the two men in language of extraordinary intensity, devoted companionship, physical closeness, and a grief, when Patroclus is finally killed in battle, so total that Achilles refuses to eat, drink, or care for his own wounds, and turns the entire remaining course of the war around avenging him alone. What Homer notably does not do is spell out the precise romantic or physical nature of the bond in explicit terms, leaving it, quite deliberately or not, in the kind of ambiguous space that later readers immediately rushed to fill in. And fill it in they did, remarkably quickly, by ancient standards. Later Greek writers, including the playwright Aeschylus and the philosopher Plato, both writing centuries after Homer, but still well within the ancient world itself, discussed Achilles and Patroclus explicitly as lovers, debating between themselves which man had played which role in the relationship, with the kind of confident, opinionated authority you'd expect from people arguing about a beloved piece of media centuries before the concept of a comment section existed. In other words, the argument you may have encountered in a classics lecture or an online debate about these two heroes isn't a modern invention grafted onto ancient text. It's a genuinely ancient argument, one the Greeks themselves were already having. What's beyond dispute, regardless of where you land on the debate, is that Homer presents this bond between two adult warriors as the emotional center of the entire epic, more consuming, more devastating, and more narratively important than any other relationship in the poem, romantic or otherwise. When Patroclus dies, Achilles holds funeral games in his honor on a scale usually reserved for kings.
a tradition of honouring the dead through competition that, not coincidentally, echoes the very Olympic spirit we just wandered through. Homer doesn't linger delicately on this grief either. In Book 18 of the Iliad, on learning of Patroclus's death, Achilles is described pouring dust and ash over his own head, tearing at his hair and throwing himself to the ground with such violent, uncontrolled sorrow that his companions genuinely fear he means to harm himself, standing guard over him through the night. It's some of the rawest, least restrained grief in the entirety of ancient Greek literature, poured out over a fellow warrior in a poem otherwise obsessed with honour, glory, and composure under pressure. What follows, in Book 23, is the funeral we mentioned earlier tonight, and it's worth sitting with the scale of it for a moment. Achilles has a massive pyre built, sacrifices horses and dogs upon it, and personally cuts a lock of his own hair to place in his fallen companion's hands, before organising an entire day of formal competition in his honour. Chariot racing, boxing, wrestling, archery, each event awarding prizes Achilles himself distributes, arguing with competitors over fairness with the same stubborn intensity he brings to the battlefield. It is, quite literally, the mythological ancestor of the Olympic Games we walked through earlier tonight. Grief, transformed deliberately into ritualized competition. The ancient debate over what exactly this relationship represented began astonishingly early. The playwright Aeschylus wrote an entire tragedy, now surviving only in fragments, called The Myrmidons, which portrayed the two explicitly as lovers, and even included a line mourning the loss of Patroclus's thighs, a detail ancient commentators discussed with the same directness modern audiences might discuss any romantic subplot. Oddly, the philosopher Phaedrus, speaking in Plato's Symposium, argues the reverse of what you might expect, insisting Achilles himself was the younger, more beautiful partner, despite being the story's central hero, a claim Phaedrus makes specifically to praise Achilles' willingness to die avenging Patroclus as proof of love's power to inspire even greater courage in the beloved than in the lover. Two respected ancient authors, writing generations apart, couldn't even agree on which hero played which role. Ever been part of an argument about who really loved whom in your favourite story, only to realise the argument has been going on since before your grandparents' grandparents were born? Welcome to the club. The Greeks started it.
Let's fast forward several centuries from Homer's imagined Bronze Age to a very real one, and to a companionship that the ancient sources describe with startling directness. The bond between Alexander the Great and his lifelong companion, Hephaestion. The two men were raised and educated together from boyhood, and by the time Alexander had inherited the Macedonian throne and set off to conquer most of the known world, Hephaestion stood as his closest friend, his most trusted commander, and by the account of multiple ancient historians, the great love of his life. Ancient sources record that when the pair visited the city of Troy during their campaign, Alexander made a point of honouring the tomb of Achilles, while Hephaestion honoured the tomb of Patroclus, a gesture the historians of the time understood immediately as a deliberate, public comparison, drawing a direct line between their own bond and the most famous, devoted companionship in all of Greek literature. When Hephaestion died suddenly, still a young man, Alexander's grief, as described by ancient historians, was staggering in scale. He is said to have thrown himself over the body for a full day, refusing to be moved, ordered the manes and tails of the army's horses shorn in mourning, had the physician who treated Hephaestion executed, and commissioned a funeral pyre of legendary size and expense. He petitioned that Hephaestion receive divine honours, and the entire military campaign, an operation involving tens of thousands of soldiers reshaping the map of the ancient world, was brought to a halt while its commander mourned. It's worth sitting with how openly this grief was recorded and understood by the historians of the time, not as an embarrassing footnote to be softened, but as a defining feature of one of history's most consequential men, a devotion serious enough to stop an empire in its tracks, if only for a little while. The funeral itself, held at Babylon in 324 BC, was a spectacle almost too large to properly picture. Ancient historians describe a multi-tiered pyre reportedly rising some 60 meters into the air, adorned with golden eagles, ship's prows, and elaborate friezes. Constructed at a cost so staggering that later writers debated whether the figures had simply been exaggerated out of disbelief that any single funeral could cost that much. Alexander reportedly sent messengers to consult the oracle of Ammon in the Egyptian desert, requesting formal permission to honor Hephaestion as a divine hero. A request historians note the oracle apparently granted, at least according to the accounts that survive, though ancient sources disagree on the exact wording and the precise honors ultimately settled upon. For weeks afterward, Alexander is described as refusing food, neglecting his own appearance, and postponing military and administrative business that had, until that moment, never once been delayed for any reason, personal or otherwise, across more than a decade of relentless campaigning. Soldiers across the empire were ordered into mourning. Sacred fires in Persian temples were extinguished in a gesture of communal grief, an honor ordinarily reserved only for the death of a king. For an empire built almost entirely on the sheer momentum of Alexander's unbroken forward motion, this sudden and total halt reads, even at this distance, as something genuinely seismic. It's worth noting that ancient historians writing about Alexander, men like Arrian and Plutarch, working centuries after these events, but drawing on earlier, now lost sources closer to Alexander's own lifetime, treat this grief not as scandal requiring careful handling, but as a defining, almost expected feature of a man whose entire life had already been shaped by conscious, deliberate comparison to Achilles. Alexander is said to have carried a copy of the Iliad with him on every campaign, kept beneath his pillow alongside a dagger, and to have modelled his own friendship with Hephaestion quite deliberately on the bond between Achilles and Patroclus we just spent time with. He got the ending too, in a way neither of them would have chosen. Ever had a friendship you modelled, half-jokingly, on your favourite story, only for the tragic parts to end up feeling a little too accurate? Alexander lived that discomfort at the scale of an actual empire. Before we leave this thread, it's worth widening the frame slightly, because love between men was not the only variation on this theme that Greek culture wrote about openly. On the island of Lesbos, a poet named Sappho wrote verses of longing and desire directed at other women, verses so vivid and personal they've survived in fragments for roughly 2,500 years and given us both the word lesbian and the word sapphic. Very little of her actual biography survives with certainty, and historians are careful about separating the woman from the myths that grew up around her. but the poetry itself speaks plainly of desire between women as a subject worth putting into verse and performing for an audience, without apparent need for disguise or euphemism. The wider point is this: ancient Greek culture, across its many city-states and several centuries, held a genuinely varied and sometimes contradictory set of attitudes toward love, desire, and relationships, shaped by local custom, social status, and the particular philosophical fashions of the moment. It resists being flattened into a single tidy headline in either direction. Either the ancient Greeks were simply accepting, or the ancient Greeks were simply strict. The truth, as it so often is, was messier, more specific, and more interesting than either version. And understanding it honestly means sitting with that complexity rather than smoothing it away. What survives of Sappho's actual writing is heartbreakingly fragmentary. Verses often preserved only because a later grammarian happened to quote a single line to illustrate a point about meter or dialect, or because a scrap of papyrus used to wrap an Egyptian mummy centuries later happened to be a discarded copy of her poems. One of her most famous surviving fragments describes, in vivid physical detail, the racing heart, sweating palms, and ringing ears of watching someone she desires speak gently to another person nearby. A description so precise and so recognizable that later Roman poets openly borrowed its structure wholesale for their own verses, a compliment measured essentially in plagiarism. Sappho also composed epithalamia, formal wedding songs performed for brides on the island of Lesbos, teasing the groom, praising the bride's beauty, and blessing the marriage. Work that sat comfortably alongside her more intimate verses without any apparent sense of contradiction. Evidence that her world, much like the male-centered world we've spent most of tonight inside, didn't necessarily treat marriage and romantic desire as competing tracks. Ancient tradition describes her presiding over something like a circle or informal school of young women on Lesbos, companions in poetry, music, and, the verses suggest, considerably more. Though how literally to take the surviving biographical details, many invented or exaggerated by later comic playwrights who found her an irresistible target for mockery, remains a genuine and ongoing scholarly debate. By the time Roman writers encountered her centuries later, Sappho had already become something of a legend, admired, imitated, occasionally slandered, by comedians looking for an easy laugh at a famous woman's expense. What has proven remarkably durable through all that fragmentary transmission, invented gossip, and centuries of moralizing later commentators uncomfortable with what she'd actually written, is the plain fact that her verses never once apologize for their subject. She wrote what she felt, put a name and a place to it, and let it survive on its own terms. Ever had a diary entry outlive every embarrassing thing you assumed would get lost to time? Sappho's outlived an entire fallen empire, several religious upheavals, and roughly 2,500 years of people trying to explain it away. Let's shift now to marriage, because it operated on an almost entirely separate track from everything we've just discussed, and understanding that separation is key to understanding the whole culture. Marriage in ancient Greece, and particularly in Athens, was primarily a civic and economic arrangement, not a romantic one. Young women, often still in their teens, were married to men considerably older, in unions arranged by their fathers, built around family alliances, property, dowries, and the production of legitimate citizen children. A bride typically moved from her father's household directly into her husband's, often barely knowing him, in a transition that had far more in common with a business merger than what most of us would picture as a wedding. The purpose of marriage was explicitly civic, to produce citizen heirs, manage a household, and maintain the family line and its property. Romantic passion, if it developed at all within a marriage, was considered a pleasant bonus rather than the point of the institution. Meanwhile, deep emotional and romantic bonds, the kind celebrated in the symposium and immortalized on the battlefield, very often lived in the relationships we've spent tonight discussing, running in parallel to marriage rather than in place of it. It's a genuinely different way of organizing a life than the one most modern audiences grew up expecting, where romance and marriage are assumed to be the same project. In ancient Greece, they were frequently two entirely separate arrangements, each with its own rules, its own purpose, and its own social expectations, coexisting without much sense of contradiction. The wedding itself, when it finally happened, followed a fairly consistent choreography across Athenian households. It began with a formal betrothal called the neh, essentially a legal contract negotiated between the bride's father and the prospective groom, settling the dowry and formally transferring guardianship, conducted with witnesses present and treated with the seriousness of any binding business agreement, because that is, functionally, exactly what it was. On the wedding day itself, the bride bathed in water drawn from a specific sacred spring, believed to bring fertility and purity to the union, before being dressed, veiled, and crowned with a wreath for the procession to follow. As evening fell, the bride was carried by torchlight in a formal procession from her father's house to her new husband's home, accompanied by singing, music, and a wedding hymn, her mother traditionally carrying the torches that lit the way, a detail that turns an otherwise business-like arrangement into something genuinely beautiful to picture, dozens of flickering lights moving together through darkened streets. Sesame cakes, symbolizing fertility, were served at the wedding feast, and the newlyweds were escorted to the marriage chamber amid considerable good-natured teasing from the assembled guests, a custom that would feel entirely familiar to anyone who has survived a modern wedding reception with an especially enthusiastic best man. Once married, a woman's daily life centered almost entirely on the household, weaving cloth, managing the domestic staff, and overseeing the raising of children under the legal authority of a kyrios, a male guardian, first her father and then her husband, who handled essentially all of her formal dealings with the wider world, since Athenian women could not independently make major legal or financial transactions in their own name. It's a genuinely stark contrast to everything else we've walked through tonight. A culture capable of writing philosophy's most enduring meditations on love and freedom, while building its most foundational domestic institution almost entirely around practical necessity rather than the romantic passion it discussed so eloquently everywhere else. Let's take a breath from all this philosophy and talk about something equally sacred to the Greeks: dinner. The everyday Greek diet ran on bread, olives, olive oil, cheese, and wine, supplemented with fish for those near the coast, and meat mostly reserved for festivals and sacrifices, where it was shared communally after being offered to the gods. Barley porridge, not bread, was often the true daily staple for ordinary households, bread being something of an upgrade reserved for those with a little more coin. Honey served as the primary sweetener, since sugar as we know it didn't exist yet, drizzled over cakes, or lending sweetness to a marinade. Wine was central to daily life, though drinking it neat was considered faintly barbaric. It was mixed with water, typically at a ratio that would strike modern drinkers as almost comically weak, though the strength of the mixture at a symposium could rise as the night went on, and as the symposiarch's mood shifted.
Meals were simple by later standards, eaten while reclining at more formal gatherings, seated at ordinary family tables the rest of the time, and always finished with a small offering poured out to the gods before anyone touched their own cup. Even dinner came with a little ritual attached, a reminder that in ancient Greece, almost nothing, including a snack, happened without some acknowledgement of the divine looking on. A morning trip to the agora for food shopping was its own small ritual, conducted mostly by the male head of household or a household slave rather than the wife herself, since the marketplace, as we've seen, was overwhelmingly a male social space. You'd haggle over fish still glistening from the morning catch, laid out on woven mats rather than proper counters, alongside baskets of dark, wrinkled olives cured in brine for months, their sharp, salty smell cutting through the sweeter scent of fresh bread cooling nearby. Cheese came wrapped in reeds or fig leaves, soft and tangy, made from goat or sheep's milk rather than cow, since cattle were relatively scarce and far too valuable as plough animals to casually slaughter for dairy. Cooking itself happened over an open hearth or a portable clay brazier, since proper ovens were a luxury not every household could afford, meaning much of the everyday diet leaned toward things that could be grilled, boiled, or stewed rather than baked. Fish and vegetables skewered and charred over coals, lentil and bean stews simmering for hours, thickened with barley. Meals were eaten almost entirely by hand, torn pieces of flatbread doing double duty as both food and utensil, scooping stew and mopping up olive oil in a single practical motion that would make a modern etiquette instructor faintly nervous and a modern taco enthusiast feel right at home. Wine quality varied enormously by region, and connoisseurs, much like modern ones, had strong and frequently argued opinions about it.
Wines from the island of Chios and the region of Thassos were particularly praised in poetry for their strength and sweetness, while cheaper local vintages were what most households actually drank on an ordinary evening. The ancient equivalent of the difference between a bottle saved for a special occasion and the everyday jug kept under the counter. Honey, meanwhile, did enormous work in a world without sugar. Drizzled over cheese, folded into cakes, and used to preserve fruit, giving Greek desserts a dense, sticky sweetness that any modern baker would recognize instantly, even without a single grain of sugar anywhere in the recipe. Let's talk about the theatre, because the Greeks didn't just live these dramas, arguments and love stories. They staged them, publicly, for enormous audiences, in competitions that could make or break a playwright's entire career. The Theatre of Dionysus, carved into the hillside below the Acropolis, could seat thousands, and theatre-going was less a quiet cultural outing and more a raucous civic festival, complete with food, wine, and audience members who were not shy about booing a play they disliked. Tragedies explored fate, family, and the terrible weight of the gods' attention, while comedies did the opposite entirely, mocking politicians, philosophers, and current events with a bluntness that would make a modern satirist blush. The playwright Aristophanes, whose speech we heard earlier at Plato's Symposium, was in fact a real comic writer, and his actual plays regularly poked fun at Athenian society's habits, including its romantic customs, its politics, and its philosophers, Socrates very much included. It's worth appreciating that this culture was fully capable of taking love, philosophy, and civic virtue with total seriousness in one context, and mercilessly mocking all three, the very next afternoon in another. There's something wonderfully familiar in that. A society that could hold a solemn philosophical dinner party on Tuesday and a biting comedy roasting the very same philosophers on Wednesday, and consider both equally essential to a well-rounded week. The city Dionysia, held each spring in honor of the god Dionysus, was the grandest of these festivals, a multi-day civic event during which the ordinary business of the city essentially paused so everyone could attend. Playwrights submitted groups of 4 plays each, typically 3 tragedies followed by a lighter satire play as a kind of tonal palate cleanser, competing for a prize judged by a panel of citizens, while a separate winter festival called the Lenaya hosted much of the era's biting political comedy. Every role, including every female character, was performed by male actors wearing large painted masks and elaborate costumes, a convention that allowed a single small cast to play numerous roles across a single performance simply by switching masks between scenes. The audience itself behaved nothing like a hushed modern theatre crowd. Spectators ate, commented loudly, and were entirely willing to boo a performance they found weak, occasionally pelting particularly disappointing actors with whatever snack food happened to be within reach. And because most tragedies drew on myths the entire audience already knew by heart, the suspense wasn't really about what would happen. Everyone already knew Oedipus would eventually discover the terrible truth about his own family. The tension instead came from how skillfully a playwright built toward an ending the crowd was watching arrive in slow, inevitable motion. It's an entirely different relationship with narrative than the one most modern audiences expect. Closer to watching a beloved story retold by a gifted performer than experiencing a genuine plot twist. Spoilers rendered completely irrelevant by simple cultural literacy. Comedy, meanwhile, held nothing sacred. Aristophanes' plays regularly mocked living politicians by name, parodied philosophers on stage in front of the very crowds those philosophers had lectured that same week, and occasionally imagined absurd fantastical premises, women staging a city-wide sex strike to end a war, a chorus of literal frogs debating literary merit, purely to skewer contemporary Athenian society's pretensions. Imagine your city's most respected public intellectuals attending a play specifically written to humiliate them, in costume, in front of thousands of their neighbours, and then being expected to laugh along good-naturedly the next morning at the agora. Athenian civic life demanded a genuinely thick skin, and apparently everyone involved had developed one. Let's talk about what everyone is actually wearing, because ancient Greek clothing is considerably simpler and considerably more practical than the flowing marble statue image you might be picturing. Most people, men and women alike, wore a chiton, essentially a large rectangle of fabric, usually linen or wool, pinned at the shoulders and belted at the waist, requiring no needle, no buttons, and remarkably few decisions. A heavier cloak, called a himation, could be draped over it for warmth or formality, and the wealthy distinguished themselves largely through the quality of the fabric and dye, rather than any elaborate cut, since the basic garment itself stayed roughly the same up and down the social scale. It's the ancient equivalent of a well-designed capsule wardrobe, one flattering shape, endless variation in fabric quality, and virtually no laundry day anxiety about what goes with what. Bathing happened in public bathhouses and at the gymnasium, using olive oil rather than soap, scraped off the skin afterward with a curved tool called a strigil, which also conveniently removed a layer of dust, sweat, and sand from the day's wrestling. It's a surprisingly effective system once you get used to the idea, though it does mean that ancient Greek personal hygiene smelled overwhelmingly, permanently, of olives. Not everyone wore the same chiton, of course, and the variations tell you a great deal about status at a glance. Labourers, farmers, and craftsmen often wore a simpler garment called the exermis, fastened over just one shoulder, leaving the other arm free for manual work, a practical uniform for anyone whose day involved actual physical labour rather than leisurely philosophical debate. Colour and dye quality marked wealth clearly too, since the deep, famously expensive purple derived from a particular sea snail was so costly to produce that it was worn almost exclusively by the wealthy, or reserved for ceremonial trim, the ancient equivalent of a colour so exclusive it might as well have come with a price tag stitched into the hem. Hair carried its own social meaning. Boys typically wore their hair long until reaching a formal coming-of-age milestone, at which point a ceremonial haircut was performed and the shorn locks dedicated as an offering to a god, often Apollo, marking the transition into young adulthood in a single symbolic snip. Women, meanwhile, arranged their hair elaborately for public appearances, often bound up with ribbons, pins, or a simple headband, and used cosmetics that, from a modern safety standpoint, were genuinely alarming. A white powder made from lead to lighten the complexion, and red ochre or crushed mulberries for colour on the cheeks and lips, beauty routines pursued with real enthusiasm and, unfortunately, real long-term health consequences nobody at the time understood. Perfume was its own thriving industry. Oils infused with rose, iris, or myrrh, applied to different parts of the body according to fairly specific fashionable convention, and prized enough that certain scented oils were traded across the Mediterranean as luxury goods in their own right, all of which meant that a well-groomed Athenian citizen, freshly returned from a morning at the gymnasium, walked around trailing a genuinely complicated aromatic signature: sweat, olive oil, wrestling pit dust, and a determined splash of rose or myrrh oil layered defiantly on top, doing its very best, and not always succeeding, to win the argument. Let's step off the street for a moment and into an actual home, because everything we've discussed so far, the agora, the symposium, the gymnasium, was public life, and public life was only ever half the story. A typical Greek house presented almost nothing to the street: blank, whitewashed walls, a single unassuming door, no windows facing outward at street level. It's a design philosophy that prized privacy and security over curb appeal, the architectural equivalent of a person who keeps all their personality tucked away until you're actually invited inside. Step through that unassuming door, though, and the house opens around a central courtyard, open to the sky, which supplied light, air, and often a small altar for household rituals, the true heart of daily domestic life. Rooms were arranged around this courtyard according to function and, quite deliberately, according to gender. The andron, that same men's dining room where the symposiums we discussed earlier actually took place, was typically positioned near the entrance, allowing male guests to come and go without ever needing to pass through the more private areas of the home. The gynaikonitis, the women's quarters, sat further back or upstairs, where the household's wives, daughters, and female servants spent the bulk of their time, weaving, managing household affairs, and raising children, largely separate from the comings and goings of male social life happening just rooms away. Furniture throughout was sparse by modern standards: simple wooden couches, chests for storage, and little else, since most household wealth was invested in textiles, dishes, and the enslaved labour that ran the home, rather than in furnishings. It's worth remembering, as you picture the philosophers and symposium guests we've spent so much of tonight with, that every one of them eventually walked home from all that public debating into a house built quite deliberately to separate exactly who got to participate in which parts of Greek life, and where. The kitchen itself, tucked near the courtyard for ventilation, centred on an open hearth rather than any enclosed oven, meaning most homes lived with a fairly constant haze of wood smoke drifting through the lower rooms, since proper chimneys were rare and mostly theoretical. Large ceramic storage jars, called pithoi, some tall enough to reach a grown adult's waist, stood sunk part-way into the floor or braced against a wall, holding the household's reserves of grain, olive oil, and wine, a home's entire pantry essentially represented by a handful of enormous, very breakable jars that everyone in the family had strong feelings about not knocking over. Water came from a household cistern collecting rainwater, or more often from a shared public fountain, meaning a genuine portion of any wife's or female servant's day involved walking to and from that fountain with heavy clay jars balanced against the hip, a task depicted constantly on surviving pottery. Women gathered chatting at the fountain house in scenes that read essentially as the ancient equivalent of catching up with neighbours at the local well, except considerably more physically demanding and with genuinely serious consequences if you dropped the jar. Bathroom arrangements were, to put it gently, considerably less refined than everything else we've discussed tonight. Most households relied on simple, portable chamber pots, emptied out into the street or a designated pit, a practice that meant walking through certain parts of an ancient Greek city required a level of vigilance modern pedestrians rarely need to exercise.
At the centre of it all, quite literally, sat the household hearth, sacred to the goddess Hestia, kept burning as a symbol of the family's continuity and never allowed to go out entirely, tended carefully by whichever family member held that daily responsibility. It's a fitting image to end on, a home built around public appearances at the front door and rigid gender divisions at the back, but organised, at its very centre, around one small, stubbornly persistent flame that everyone, regardless of status, was expected to help keep alive. Let's talk about the gods, because they were not tucked away in temples on Sundays here. They were woven into absolutely everything, watching over meals, journeys, marriages, and, apparently, most romantic entanglements as well. Greek religious life ran on festivals, sacrifice, and a genuinely enormous pantheon of gods and goddesses, each with their own domain, temperament, and preferred offerings. The Pan-Athenaic festival, held in Athens in honour of the goddess Athena, filled the streets with processions, athletic competitions and sacrifices, turning the whole city into a rolling, days-long celebration. Smaller household rituals happened constantly too: a poured libation before a meal, a prayer before a journey,
an offering before a symposium even properly got underway. Eros, the god most closely associated with desire and romantic love, was taken every bit as seriously as any other deity in the pantheon, worshipped, invoked, and blamed in equal measure whenever love struck someone rather inconveniently. It's rather comforting in its way to know that no matter how philosophically sophisticated your dinner party conversation about the nature of love became, someone at the table was probably still quietly blaming a minor deity for their current romantic troubles. An animal sacrifice, the culture's most common religious ritual, followed its own careful choreography. Barley grains were scattered over the altar and the animal itself, a knife concealed beneath them until the final moment, its throat cut swiftly while attending women let out a ritual cry. The animal was then butchered on the spot, its thigh bones wrapped in fat and burned on the altar, the resulting smoke rising up as the god's designated portion of the meal, while the actual meat, the tender, edible part, was roasted and shared out among the human worshippers attending. It's worth pointing out, because ancient writers themselves noted the joke, that this arrangement conveniently left the gods with smoke and bone, while the humans kept the dinner, a division of labour. Greek mythology itself explains through a story about the trickster Prometheus, cleverly rigging the very first sacrifice in humanity's favour. Consulting the gods for guidance on serious matters, war, colonisation, marriage, often meant a genuinely arduous pilgrimage to an oracle, the most famous being Apollo's shrine at Delphi, perched dramatically on the slopes of Mount Parnassus. There, a priestess called the Pythia, seated on a tripod over a fissure in the rock said to release intoxicating vapours, delivered the god's answers in a trance, words a team of priests then interpreted and reshaped into the deliberately ambiguous, riddling verse Delphi became famous for. Answers vague enough to technically be correct, no matter how events actually unfolded, an early and remarkably durable form of covering your bases. Beyond these grand civic and oracular occasions, ordinary religious devotion happened constantly and quietly at home. A small clay votive figurine left at a household shrine, a prayer murmured before a journey, a lock of hair or a favourite childhood toy dedicated to a god at a milestone birthday.
Layer all of this on top of a civic calendar already packed with public festivals, dozens of them annually across the Greek world, and you get a culture whose relationship with religion was less an occasional Sunday obligation and considerably more a constant ambient hum running underneath every single other thing discussed tonight, from dinner parties to funerals to, apparently, more than a few disappointing romantic outcomes. Let's talk, gently, about what came after all this living. Because the Greeks thought about death with the same seriousness they brought to everything else, and their customs are worth sitting with quietly rather than rushing past. When someone died, the body was washed, anointed with oil, dressed, and laid out at home for family and friends to visit and mourn, a ritual called the prothesis, before a formal procession, the ekphora, carried it to burial, usually just before dawn. A small coin, an obol, was traditionally placed in or on the mouth of the deceased, payment for Charon, the ferryman believed to carry souls across the river, separating the world of the living from the underworld realm of Hades. Without the coin, the stories warned, a soul might wander the riverbank for 100 years, unable to cross, which is either a deeply poetic image or a very early argument for always carrying exact change. The Greek underworld itself was not the single simple afterlife you might expect. Most ordinary souls were believed to drift on as faint shadows through the grey, unremarkable fields of asphodel, neither punished nor particularly rewarded. Those judged to have lived with particular wickedness were sent to Tartarus, a place of genuine punishment, and a fortunate few, heroes, the specially favoured, were said to reach Elysium, a paradise of ease and light. It was Achilles, that same warrior we spent time with earlier, whom later tradition placed among the blessed dead of Elysium, or, in some versions, reunited on the Isles of the Blessed with the very companion whose loss had once undone him. Funeral customs also included, for the wealthy or the greatly honoured, funeral games, athletic competitions held in tribute to the dead, exactly the kind Achilles staged for Patroclus in the Iliad, a tradition of turning grief into ritualized competition that connects the quiet solemnity of a Greek burial directly back to the roaring crowds at Olympia. Surviving grave monuments, carved stone stelae marking a burial, often depicted the deceased in tender, ordinary scenes, clasping hands with a loved one, a family member, or a companion. A small and human detail that has survived far longer than the person it was carved to honour. The period of mourning itself followed its own recognisable rhythm. Women of the household, and sometimes professional mourners hired specifically for the occasion, were expected to wail and lament loudly during the prothesis, tearing at their hair or cutting it short as a visible sign of grief. A custom vivid enough that later Athenian lawmakers, worried about excessive public displays turning into something closer to spectacle, actually passed legislation limiting how extravagant funeral mourning was permitted to be, which tells you something about how dramatically some families were apparently competing to out-grieve their neighbours. Grave goods, buried alongside the deceased, were typically modest by later standards. Small personal items, a favourite piece of jewellery, a child's toy, a clay figurine, and that single obol for Charon's fair. Though wealthier families sometimes marked a burial with an elaborate carved stone monument, a stele, depicting the departed in a quiet, dignified scene, often clasping hands with a loved one in a farewell gesture historians call the dexiosis, a small carved handshake meant to last considerably longer than the grief that inspired it. Proper burial itself carried enormous weight in Greek belief, not simply as a mark of respect, but as a genuine practical necessity for the soul's passage onward. A body left unburied, whether through poverty, war, or deliberate cruelty, was believed to leave its spirit trapped, unable to cross into the underworld properly, doomed to wander restlessly between worlds. This belief sat at the very heart of one of Athenian theatre's most enduring tragedies, Sophocles' Antigone, in which a young woman defies a direct royal decree, risking her own execution simply to ensure her brother receives proper burial rites. A story the original audience would have understood immediately as being about something far weightier than family loyalty alone. It's worth remembering, as this long night in ancient Greece begins winding toward its own quiet close, that a culture this preoccupied with love, glory, and pleasure was, underneath all of it, just as preoccupied with making sure nobody it cared about was left to wander alone in the dark. Before we start winding down tonight,
It's worth pausing honestly on something we touched on earlier, because a fair account of this dazzling, philosophical, wine-soaked world has to include who was excluded from most of it. The vibrant civic and intellectual life we've walked through tonight, the agora debates, the symposiums, the gymnasium, full citizenship itself, belonged almost entirely to free adult men born of Athenian parents. Women, even those born into wealthy citizen families, were largely confined to the household, excluded from formal education, public debate, and political life. Their world built around managing a home, raised and reclining at a dinner party discussing the nature of love. Enslaved people, who made up a very significant portion of the population, had no legal standing, no voice in the culture's grand philosophical conversations, and did an enormous share of the physical labor that made all of this leisurely debating possible in the first place. It's worth sitting with the contradiction plainly, rather than smoothing it over with a joke. A culture that produced some of history's most enduring writing on love, freedom, and the good life built its entire leisurely philosophical world on the labor and exclusion of people who were denied a voice in describing their own. Both things are true about ancient Greece: its genuine intellectual brilliance and its genuine, deep unfairness. And an honest journey through this world has to carry both, without letting one erase the other. The numbers involved, where historians can estimate them at all, are genuinely sobering. Enslaved people are believed to have made up a very substantial share of the population in classical Athens, their conditions varying enormously by role. A household slave might live in relative proximity to the family, involved in daily domestic tasks, and occasionally granted a degree of trust and even eventual freedom. A slave sent to labor in the silver mines at Laurion, however, faced conditions ancient writers themselves described as brutal, working underground in cramped, dangerous tunnels that fueled the very silver coinage stamped with Athens' beloved owl, the wealth that helped build the Parthenon rising, painted and gleaming, over a city whose prosperity rested substantially on labor performed by people with no legal voice whatsoever in how that city governed itself. Resident foreigners, called metics, occupied their own uneasy middle ground, permitted to live and conduct business within the city, required to pay a special tax for the privilege, and expected in some cities to serve in the military alongside citizens, yet permanently barred from citizenship, land ownership, or a vote in the assembly, no matter how many generations their family had lived there.
Women, as we've discussed at several points tonight, faced their own comprehensive exclusion, unable to attend the assembly, serve on juries, speak in court on their own behalf, or independently manage property, their entire legal existence routed through a male guardian for the whole of their lives. It's worth resisting the urge to simply file this away as an unfortunate historical footnote and move on. The philosophy, the poetry, the leisurely gymnasium mornings and wine-soaked evenings we've spent tonight admiring were made possible, structurally and directly, by this same excluded labor and this same denied citizenship. Ancient Greece's intellectual brilliance and its genuine injustice were not separate stories running in parallel. They were, quite literally, the same economy, built on the same foundations, and an honest account of this dazzling world has to hold both truths in the same hand, without letting the marble and the philosophy talk us out of remembering who was left standing outside the gate. Let's talk about what happened to all of this afterward, because the story doesn't end neatly with ancient Athens. As Greek culture gave way first to the Hellenistic kingdoms and eventually to Roman rule, attitudes toward male relationships shifted, absorbed into new frameworks with their own rules about status and propriety. Rome inherited a great deal from Greek culture, including many of its assumptions about love between men, though reshaped through a distinctly Roman lens concerned with dominance, citizenship, and social hierarchy, rather than the philosophical framing the Greeks preferred. Later still, as the ancient Mediterranean world gave way to Christianity's spread across the region, attitudes shifted again, more dramatically, and much of what had once been openly celebrated in poetry and philosophy became something spoken of very differently, if at all, for a very long stretch of the centuries that followed. Understanding ancient Greek attitudes honestly means resisting the urge to treat them as a simple ancestor of any modern position, either as a straightforward endorsement of acceptance we recognize today, or as a simple relic to be dismissed. It was its own thing, built on its own logic, shaped by its own assumptions about status, citizenship, and the soul. And it deserves to be understood on those terms, complicated as they are, rather than flattened into whichever modern argument wants to claim it. The shift under Roman rule is worth understanding in a bit more detail, because it wasn't simply a continuation of Greek custom under a new flag. Roman attitudes toward relationships between men were shaped far more heavily by questions of dominance, citizenship status, and who was doing what to whom, than by the philosophical framework of mentorship and mutual devotion the Greeks had preferred. A relationship considered admirable by Greek standards between social equals bound by genuine affection could be viewed quite differently through Roman eyes, more concerned with maintaining a citizen's proper standing than with the emotional substance of the bond itself. Rome absorbed the practice, in other words, but not always the philosophy that had once justified it. The more dramatic turning point came several centuries later, as Christianity became the dominant religious and moral authority across the former Roman world. By the 6th century AD, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian had formally criminalized such relationships under law, a stark legal reversal from the open philosophical discussion we've spent tonight exploring. And for a very long stretch of the centuries that followed, much of what Plato had once published under his own name, and Aeschines had once argued in open court, became something discussed quietly, if at all, in most of the Western world.
It's worth knowing, too, that serious academic interest in these ancient sources returned much later than you might expect, gaining real momentum only in the 20th century, when historians like Kenneth Dover published careful, systematic studies of the surviving evidence, the vases, the court speeches, the philosophical texts, reopening a conversation the ancient world itself had once conducted quite openly. Understanding what the Greeks actually believed, rather than what later centuries assumed or projected backward onto them, required historians to set aside their own era's assumptions and read the evidence on its own terms, a process that continues today, carefully, argument by argument, very much in the same spirit of open scholarly dispute the Greeks themselves would have recognized and probably rather enjoyed watching unfold. So here we are, at the end of a very long walk through a very old city, and it's worth gathering up the contradiction because it sits at the center of everything we've explored tonight. This was a culture that could write, with total seriousness, some of history's most enduring philosophy on the nature of love, and build a legendary military unit on the strength of romantic devotion between men, while also organizing an entire economic and civic order around excluding women and enslaved people from that very same conversation. It could celebrate the trained male body in marble and bronze on every street corner, and hold customs around age and status that sit uneasily with modern values. It could discuss desire as openly and rigorously as any subject in philosophy, while still treating marriage as a business arrangement largely separate from romantic feeling entirely. None of this resolves into a single tidy verdict, and it isn't supposed to. Ancient Greece was not a simple utopia of acceptance, and it was not a simple story of repression either. It was a specific, complicated, deeply human society working out its own answers to questions we are, in many ways, still asking. History rarely fits into a tidy box, and neither, it turns out, did they. Think back for a moment over everything this single walk through one ancient city has actually held. A legendary battalion built entirely on romantic devotion, and a legal system willing to end a man's career over how that devotion had been conducted. A warrior whose grief for his companion reshaped the entire back half of history's most famous epic, and an emperor centuries later who modelled his own heartbreak on that very story, right down to the funeral games. A woman on a distant island whose verses about desire between women survived empires, religious upheaval, and 2,500 years of people trying to explain them away. A society that could argue, with total philosophical seriousness, that love was the ladder by which a person climbed toward eternal truth, while denying that same philosophical seriousness and every civic right attached to it to more than half the population living inside its walls. This is not a culture that resolves neatly in either direction, and it was never going to. It was not a simple ancient utopia of acceptance waiting patiently to be rediscovered by a more enlightened later age, and it was not simply a rigid, repressive relic either, deserving nothing but polite historical distance. It was something far stranger and, honestly, far more interesting than either version. A civilization working out its own answers, city-state by city-state, generation by generation, to questions about love, loyalty, status, and belonging that, if tonight has done its job properly, you'll recognize as considerably less settled in your own era than you might have assumed walking in. History rarely fits into a tidy box, and neither, it turns out, did they. So, how was your day in ancient Greece? You wandered a marketplace and got cornered by a barefoot philosopher, reclined through a wine-soaked evening of speeches about split-apart soulmates, and stood at the edge of a gymnasium watching a culture celebrate the human body without a flicker of self-consciousness. You learned that this world had a word for nearly every shade of love, except the one true universal feeling of hoping you brought enough coins to cover the wine. You walked among philosophers who took love seriously enough to argue about it for centuries, and soldiers who trusted it enough to build an army around it. And you carried, quietly, the honest knowledge that this same shimmering world left an awful lot of people standing outside its gates. As you settle in now, wherever you actually are, with your own soft blankets and your own version of the modern world, take a quiet moment to notice what nearly 3,000 years of distance has actually changed, and what, in some quiet way, it really hasn't.
People have always argued about love. They have always tried to build philosophy and poetry, and even armies around it. Somewhere in ancient Athens, a dinner party is still going, in a manner of speaking, still arguing about the true nature of the soul, long after everyone at that particular table turned to dust and marble. Let the sandals come off. Let the wine bowl empty. Let the whole sun-bleached, marble-columned, wonderfully argumentative world fade gently into the dark behind you. Sleep well. Tomorrow the philosophers will still be arguing, and honestly, they'll manage just fine without you.